In this discussion of anarchy, we will examine the core concept as it relates to international relations and as it applies to American foreign policy. We begin this lecture with an examination of one of our discussion questions. We start by asking, how far back do we analyze events when examining foreign policy? And what I mean by this is when a policymaker has to make decisions, when we're in the decision-making process, or we're thinking critically about a course of action, how far back do we analyze foreign policy? Obviously, this applies to domestic politics as well. It's important to think through how far back can we go. In foreign policy, at its core, there's anarchy, which says because there is no consistency, there's no overarching authority in the international system, there's contextualization that matters. I want you to be critical about foreign policy events and critical about domestic events. Okay? And recognize, at least from where I sit, there's no right answer to this. Okay? This is one of those, if you should have already listened to this social science lecture, where I don't know if there's even a political truth on this. What I can say in the foreign policy arena is that we need to be mindful about the multidimensionality of the question. First, it's a relationship. There's another country, another actor, another entity on the other side of it, and you have to not just plan for what they go back in terms of their memory or in terms of how they analyze policy, but then shape how you think critically about it based on the other side. Because when you're deciding those strategic interactions, as we have learned in other classes, the strategic means that you're making the best choices possible given the strategies of other players. Well, you need to know what the other players' strategies are and what they're doing. So when we think about foreign policy, how far back do we go? I want you to write that. This is discussion question 2. Cut and paste that into your written prompt for discussion board number 2 and answer it. Use some examples if you want. You may not use the US-Iran case that we're going to walk through as the example or as an example, but if an example helps. I also want you to recognize, so there's the other player. The other thing to recognize is that there are multiple issues that determine the interaction and what events are used in analyzing foreign policy. So in this context, think about the United States and Russia. The United States and Russia have a contentious history, particularly on issues related to national security, the Middle East, investments, finances, and certainly kind of nuclear politics, Cold War. Yet, on space, these two countries consistently collaborate for the betterment of scientific exploration. Right? So up until 2 Saturdays ago, the United States were hitching astronauts to the International Space Station were being launched in Suez capsules. The Russians never threatened to cut off U.S. access to the International Space Station, though they did, as you can imagine, increase the price as soon as the shuttle system, the shuttles in the United States stopped launching. So how is it that in some issue spaces, especially Russian and American memory, may go back hundreds of years, right, to influence cooperation or lack thereof, where in space, for the most part, it says, hey, we're going to remember the last 20 years of cooperation. This is for scientific endeavor. Okay, so it could be on issue space. The last issue, so the first one is multiple actors on the other side that you have to consider. The next is the issue space. The third area to consider when you think about events and back history, how much change happens? Do we reconsider events when, in American foreign policy, when it's a different president of the United States, when it's a different president in the other country? What happens if the other country has gone through substantial political change, i.e. going from monarchy to a democracy, or being a colony to an independent country, or not being a state to being a state to not being a state anymore because of internal strife? How do you think about foreign policy in those multiple contexts? You don't necessarily have to answer all of those, just answer that question, but think critically about it, because obviously answering this type of question has huge influence on domestic politics, on international relations, and it's something that needs to be engaged. All right, so let's think about the US-Iran conflict. What do you remember of it? Right? When would you say the conflict starts? Typically in class, because it's a foreign policy class and you've had history, international relations classes, we tend to go back to the Iranian Revolution. Right? But just walk through the most initial steps and think, how far back should we go? Should we stop at the ballistic missile attacks against the United States in January of 2020 to help inform how current decisions are made? Well, probably not, right? Because those are in response to the attack on the assassination of Soleimani in 2008, which itself was a response to Shiite militias threatening U.S. embassies, which was itself a response to the U.S. hitting Iranian-supported units in Iraq and Syria, which was in response to the death of a contractor at the hands of some of the militias. Should we go back further? Yeah, of course we should. Okay? And if we pick up the pace a little bit, we can think about 2015 Iranian nuclear deal, the invasion of Iraq. The Iranian Revolution is often the foremost one in Americans' mind, if you just ask them. Right? For many Iranians, I don't have any poll data on this is just me guessing, but they would probably recommend or remember the Mossadegh coup to keep the Shah in power, right? The removal of the democratic process to keep a pretty brutal dictator in power, right? Not the U.S.'s first time doing that, okay? Right? Or should we do the UK invasion in 1941 that set up so many of the infrastructures that influenced the 20th century in Iran? Or should we go all the way back to Paris 1919? Okay? Or should we go further? Right? And you can go further. For the purpose of the lecture, I stop in 1919, mostly so I can plug Margaret Millamann's book. Her book is, I think it's an absolute must-read for anyone who studies foreign policy, or honestly, anyone who wants to live in the 21st century, because so many of the decisions about borders, about states, about the placement of humans and their value in the international system occurred in Paris 1919, right? And actually the pre-conference to it. So that's where that discussion stops. But think about foreign policy, depending on if your memory only starts with the Iranian Revolution, right? If you're an American, you will have had constant news coverage of the storming of the embassy and the holding of the American personnel for hundreds of days. As one of my students also remembers, he was in D.C. when those people came home, right? And the I don't parade's too strong a term, but the buses is how he described them, of them going through the D.C. streets and people waving upon their return. If that's your start, how does that shape policy? What happens if your start is democratic suppression and the Mossadegh coup? Right, the coup to keep the Shah in power, or bring him back, so to speak. Well, if that's your memory, that's going to be different. That's the point here. And the reason why we spend so much time on asking the question of how far back do we go in foreign policy is because of anarchy. Because in anarchy, there's no system to establish a government or an order. And that applies to the order and government of ideas. And it's something that has to be engaged. So when we think about classical ideas of anarchy, those three definitions, engage them and think about how they're different. What is wealth? What is power? What is authority? Right? These are all hugely important classical interpretations. When we think about anarchy, and as the article outlines, we can think about lack of order or lack of government, and they're two different things. Okay, so both of those quotes engage those materials, engage them with thinking about order and think about government, because they're not different, they're not the same, they're distinct concepts. But both of them leverage questions about the legitimate use of force in the international system. Okay, so who in the international system has a monopoly on the use of force? And the answer is no one, right? Because states are sovereign. States might not be equal in terms of capability or placement or influence, but in theory, under some theories, for example, the United Nations, they should have equal representation, except in the Security Council, so we'll just simplify that, right? Except when they don't, right? States are equal except when they're not. And when they're not is when it relates to security, which is actually the founding motif for the UN. So maybe states just aren't equal. I don't know. Okay, the UN's kind of in it, kind of a mess. But when we think about this, are governments able to apply legitimate uses of force in foreign policy? When are they? Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of legal scholarship on this, but I want you to answer that question. And well, there is a clear answer to this one, at least clearer answers to this question. I want you to wrestle with it. Is the use of force abroad, if it's conducted by a state, legitimate? If it is, when, under all circumstances? If the state can use force illegitimately, when are those circumstances? We're not going to get into the legal side of those on some of it, but I want you to think through it. Next, we have to think about domestic and international differences. So domestically speaking, in a Weberian sense, so Weber is a scholar, wrote prolifically about the state. One of the overused and poorly understood aspects of his scholarship was that the use of force domestically, the state has the monopoly on the use of force domestically. And the way to think about that would be the state is the only entity that has the legitimate right to use force. Okay, you and I, if there's a disagreement, not you and me, we wouldn't have disagreements, but if disagreements between neighbors, for example, the one neighbor doesn't have the right to physically assault the other neighbor, right? That's protected by law. Only the state can use force. That's kind of what he's getting at. Well, Waltz would argue that the international system is decentralized. He has a system-focused approach to the international system that, again, with a kind of unitary actor assumption that we've discussed in other parts of this lecture, that state, you can discuss the United States as an entity. You wouldn't discuss it as a Democratic House, Republican Senate, and a Republican presidency currently, even though obviously that does end up mattering. In Waltz's conceptualizations, you have the fungibility of power. Military power in particular determines interactions between states in this hierarchical system, right? Equal units in terms of how they're connected, but the units themselves may not actually be equal, which is one of the limitations of his theory. And we think critically about Waltz in that it's a self-help system, right? You only get benefits in the international system if you go out and seek them or you go out and generate them. Well, that narrows the focus to a Weberian sense of the use of force, and here I'm talking about the legitimate use of force. It also excludes domestic politics, and it excludes legitimacy. So as you can imagine, there are quite a few objections to a Waltzian approach to the international system. And that's where Helen Milner's article really helps us think critically and move past some systematic theories of international relations. Okay, so what I mean there is that how states behave is determined by their position and their function within the international system, not other domestic or institutional or constructivist functions. What Milner adds, which is a tremendous amount in this article, is that is force a determining feature of government? She would say no. Right? Force can be, but it's not the determining feature. She would argue that legitimacy in the domestic sphere comes from other sources, and just like Waltz does, once you establish how the domestic polity functions, you apply it to the international system, and so legitimacy comes through in the international system as well. And so it's not that governments only rest on coercion. They rest on institutions, laws, and legitimacies. And if you do that domestically, so what she does, if you do that domestically, it applies to the international sphere as well, because remember, the international sphere are but generated and engaged by the states. So what does that end up meaning long-term for foreign policy? Well, Milner would argue that globalization and strategic interdependence are the core concepts through which the international system ends up functioning. Right? So states are still sovereign, which creates some problems for Waltz's theory, but states are still sovereign, which means they can choose their own paths, they can be inconsistent, they can be consistent, they can care about it one day, not care about it another, they can take action. But that you're strategically interdependent with other actors. Unlike Waltz and many other realist scholars, there is no decisions and foreign policy are not made in a vacuum. What Schelling would draw on here was that the ability of one to participate to gain his ends is dependent on an important degree on the choices or decisions of the other participants will make. Schelling is fundamental to international relations and honestly just critical thinking, because what he argues in this is strategic interdependence. And I think if we had class, we would go through all kinds of examples. Here, I want you to think about COVID-19. Right? There's no pandemics. We saw that. You'll see this a lot in the news. Pandemics know no borders. You're absolutely right. They know no borders. But borders do influence how states handle the disease. So if we think about, just think in the U.S. context, there's 50 U.S. states. How many different approaches to dealing with COVID have states adopted? Right? That's the same for the international system. Right? Different states have adopted different approaches to dealing with the pandemic, but they're interdependent. Right? The only state so far that I would argue that is not interdependent in the international system is New Zealand, because they essentially shut down their island nation and said, no contact, we're going to stamp this out. What will be really interesting is how they choose to open up. And I imagine it will be an extraordinary amount of complex testing and quarantining for anyone who arrives into New Zealand, because that's about the only way you can ensure that this thing doesn't continue to spread. Right? So there might be sovereignty, right? States might say, hey, we're shutting everything down, or hey, we're going to do nothing. But there's strategic independence within that. Strategic independence related to COVID-19 also extends to medicine and to many other areas that we honestly were probably not even aware of before the pandemic. So for example, I don't know what the stat is, I've seen many numbers on them, but a high percentage of generic antibiotics and antibiotics in general that are sold in the United States come from China. Think about that from a strategic interdependence standpoint. Or the fact that materials to produce N95 masks had a global supply chain. Do you think that's the same now? I mean, the supply chain that hasn't changed enough, but do you think the strategic interdependence and how states evaluate pandemics and health supplies is the same today as it was in January? And in some cases, this may actually deepen dependence in some places and weaken it in others. And that's Milner's broader point, that legitimacy, functionality, and interaction, much more than force, may determine how the international system functions. That's a brief introduction, terribly brief, introduction to anarchy. Read the article, send me questions as you have them. I hope you're safe and well.